Hi everybody, welcome to the AP Euro review session that we're having on YouTube so you all can make it. I just need to, this doesn't change that my mother just called me and so I have to tell her that I'll call her back later. I did have a couple of questions that somebody had emailed me before, so while we're waiting for everybody to kind of get in the live review, I'm going to go ahead and answer those questions so that he can find those later. So okay, the most recent question was about the Enlightened Despots and the 7 Years' War. So I thought I would start with the 7 Years' War, which I mentioned real briefly last time, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because I do think it really is like a global conflict in a way that we don't. I mean, I don't know if you could include the Napoleonic Wars as a global conflict. It's really, more limited to Europe. I guess there's a little bit outside of that. But for the most part, we don't see a global conflict of this size until World War I. So the 7 Years' War is 1756 to 1763. So if you remember, the French Revolution is in 1789, 789, because it was Hungary. We're basically talking 15-ish years before that. It really starts prior to that, though, with the War of Austrian Succession. So when Maria Theresa came to the throne, her father had to pass this law called the Pragmatic Sanction. And the Pragmatic Sanction basically just said a woman is allowed to inherit the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. And kind of taking advantage of that in this moment of Austrian weakness, Frederick II of Prussia is going to attack Silesia and take that from the Austrian Empire. So that kind of gets Austria and Prussia pitted against each other, which I think is important because if we think forward a century, this issue of like Klein and Gross Deutschland, right? Of like big or small Germany, Austria, Prussia, like who's going to rule the German states, becomes increasingly important. So this is setting the stage for that much, much earlier. By the way, if you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat and I will answer those. But I'm going to continue talking about the 7 Years' War while you guys get in here. Okay, so the other big piece of the 7 Years' War is British and French competition in the Americas, in the colonies, over colonies. They had Native American allies who would a lot of what they're arguing about is the land kind of just beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Who's going to have kind of control of that at the time, what would have been like frontier Western territory. Britain provides quite a lot of financial support to really, throwing a lot of money at defeating France. And Frederick is also aided by the British. So you end up with Great Britain and France on one side against each other. And then they both have other European allies. So the Prussians ally with Britain, and the Austrians ally with France, as does Spain, which is important because Spain had so many territories in the colonies as well, or in the New World. I guess they weren't the colonies yet. So you're basically pitting all of these European powers against each other, fighting over colonies as well as some European territorial disputes. Eventually, the Treaty of Paris that's signed in 1756 is going to give Britain sole access to North America, everything east of the Mississippi River, give them the dominant position in India, which is one of the other things that they were fighting about. Sorry, I'm just looking down at my notes here. And really India, of course, is going to become kind of the jewel in the British crown, their empire, right? And then France originally had lost some islands in the Caribbean, but they were able to kind of keep those islands in the Treaty of Paris. Britain really comes out the dominant naval power, but it's it's probably that treaty that really kind of seals British dominance in the New World is probably one of the most important things you'll look at in the 18th century, one of the most important treaties, because it's going to set up the rivalries and kind of major events on three continents. So in North America, where if you took APUSH, you probably learned the French and Indian War. That was the American theater of the 7 Years' War. It's the same war. I literally was like 35 when I had that moment and realized that. So I'm telling you now, so you don't have to have that moment. The British colonists were basically now free of the French, which was kind of a constant threat that, they would have to, that there would be conflict there over that. Um, in Europe, the 7 Years' War is really going to, um, you know, pit Germany, the German states of Austria and Prussia against each other. And also, it's going to set the stage for the French Revolution because the French had spent so much money on the 7 Years' War that they're in so much debt. That plus the aid that they send to the American colonists in the American Revolution, which is, of course, like continuing this kind of beef they have with Britain, um, is going to put them in so much debt that that's going to leave them really vulnerable for criticism, and then weaken the French monarchy. And then, of course, it's the king calls the Estates General in 1789 because he's trying to raise taxes. So if they hadn't been in such a financial crisis because of these wars, that might not have happened. If that hadn't happened, then maybe no revolution, or at least not then. And then in India, Britain is going to kind of further, chip away at the Mughal Empire and establish a much stronger colonial presence in India. So that's why the 7 Years' War is so important. It's really just this huge global conflict that's got these European powers pitted against each other, but also has worldwide consequences. So that was one question. Another question was about enlightened despots. And so I want to just break the phrase down. So we know what it means, I hope, to be enlightened, right? That they believed in the ideas of, and it seems so obvious to us, I think, because we think of this as natural rights, right? Like natural rights is the phrase. Natural rights would be life, liberty, and property. But these are so assumed by us that I think it's really hard for us to get a grasp on how radical it was for middle class Europeans to recognize that lower class Europeans had any rights, that that they weren't just like stupid and didn't just need to be controlled by sort of their wiser betters, right? Um, so that idea of natural rights is going to kind of shift thinking in Europe in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And rather than give up all of their power, you get these enlightened despots. So a despot, or an enlightened monarch, you could also call them. A despot is just someone who rules with absolute power. So enlightened despots are, I think Frederick the Great was the one who said that he saw himself as the first servant of the state. I know that was Frederick, actually. I don't think I know. And this idea of being the first servant of the state is using all of your power to make enlightened reforms, to do good for your people, not just to, live the high life as royal or try to get more territory for your country and kind of strengthen your own power for your own sake, which is more kind of how Louis XIV probably thought of things. So a couple of big things that kind of are really important there. First off, there's a big increase in reading culture in the 18th century. So an increase in uh, printed materials that are available, not just books, but also like newspapers, periodicals, flyers, novels. All of that's going to be really important later for the revolution because that's really going to spread a lot of these ideas. There's a lot more literacy in Europe by this point, and there was a stronger, or I guess a bigger availability of public education, especially for middle class men. So most European cities by the end of the 1700s have, at least one major kind of publication. And so there's a lot of news being spread around. And the enlightened despots are now leading a public that is much more literate and much more kind of informed of their rights. So you have groups like the philosophes in France, who are those French philosophers, Rousseau, who wrote, we talked about the social contract, and Emile, Montesquieu, who wrote Spirit of the Laws and Persian Letters, and Voltaire, who wrote Candide, and then also was just really involved in kind of public life. He was sort of like the granddaddy of the philosophes, was exiled from France. But those ideas had really spread amongst the public, in part because of that printing culture, but also because of things like Enlightenment salons. So Madame de Joffrin, for instance, hosted a really important salon. Um, Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's mistress, also hosted one. So people are just much more well read and much more aware of this idea that, yeah, they matter for some reason, right? So the rulers are responding to that and using their power in order to try to reform the system. You know, they are the man, but also trying to reform the man. So in Prussia, we have Frederick the Great. He, um, you know, he's really responding to Louis XIV's "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, by saying like, well, no, actually, I'm the first servant of the state. He really improved the efficiency of Prussia. He wasn't as concerned with equality, but he does improve a lot of conditions, I guess, for a lot of lower class people in Prussia. They had a really strict definition of legal classes there. Not a whole lot of social mobility. That's probably true of most places in the 18th century. The Junkers in Prussia are and it's spelled like Junkers, Jun. I'm going to type it in the chat. Are the Prussian aristocrats. So they were the landed aristocracy who got most of their power and wealth from, you know, being the controllers of these big agricultural manors. Frederick is going to really codify. To codify means like to actually set down laws in writing, right? So not necessarily a constitution limiting his power, but to have the same laws across the whole country, and enforce them with like a centralized bureaucracy. So that's important. That increases centralization. All of these, we're going to see an increase in centralization of the state. Voltaire actually lived at Frederick's court for a period of time. They had a correspondence back and forth. So, you know, he's really kind of playing the game, I guess, of having these enlightened people around him. But I would say, you know, he really is sometimes putting state above principles. Like, for instance, when he invaded Silesia, which I talked about with the Austrian War of Succession, that was in the 1740s. He didn't go ask all the Silesians, like, do you want to be a part of Prussia, right? He just took it because he decided it was good for the state. Same with like the partition of Poland in 1772 between Austria, Prussia, and Russia. In Austria, we have two enlightened monarchs to talk about. The first is Maria Theresa. She had done some reforms, but it was a little, she was really, I think all of these enlightened monarchs are kind of pushing against the nobility who are, you know, doing okay. And people who are relatively wealthy and comfortable don't necessarily want a lot of change. So she really struggled to get a whole lot of reform through. She considered trying to free all of the serfs in Austria. In the end, she didn't do it. And in part, she thought, well, hey, this would be like a lot of people for the military. So I'm not sure she was all that, you know, altruistic about it. Joseph II, though, did do a lot. He only ruled for about 10 years, but he freed the serfs. He allowed for total religious toleration within the empire, which was a huge deal. That was in 1781, the Edict on Toleration. He allowed for freedom of the press. He introduced legal equality. He also created a secret police though. So I think that that's, you see in all of these kind of this tension between wanting to keep their power and um, trying to do some good. And I just wanted to remind you guys too that you had one of those pink sheets that we did in class where you looked at the reforms of each of these enlightened monarchs, and I think you had to argue um, whether how enlightened they were. Um, so you might look for that amongst all of your pink papers. The other enlightened monarch I would mention would be Catherine the Great in Russia. She wrote a legal code. She reformed the Russian legal code called the Nakaz, Nakaz, which basically just means the instruction. And that's how she got the nickname the Great. Like that was an official sort of legal process in Russia. And however, she couldn't get the nobles to sign off on the Nakaz. So she wrote it. She wrote a letter to Voltaire telling him like, hey, I'm writing this legal code. I'm basically ripping off Montesquieu, but I think he would be okay with it because, I'm putting good things into place. She was a really strong ruler. I think that she wanted to be really enlightened, but she also, when challenged, would really back off of that. So, for instance, when during the Pugachev rebellion, there was a man who pretended to be her now dead husband, the one who had actually had the claim to the throne. She had married into the Russian royal family. She was a German princess. He was a grandson of Peter the Great. Yeah, that's right. Via his mother. And so he's the one who should have had the throne. There was sort of a coup where he was put in prison and then he was murdered in prison. And it's possible slash probable that her lover was responsible for that. But it's unclear whether she was like, "Hey, you should go do this," or whether afterwards she was like, "Okay, cool, now I'm the czarina." And so when a guy came up pretending to be her killed husband, it was clear to everyone in St. Petersburg that that wasn't possible. But to the average peasant in the like near the Crimea or sort of down south, they'd never seen the Tsar, so they didn't know. So, and whether they believed it or not, he seemed like a good guy. He was making lots of promises. So, the Pugachev rebellion, when Pugachev was finally caught, she had him drawn and quartered, and that was one of the big questions of the enlightened monarchs, was whether or not you should allow for corporal punishment, with the enlightened monarchs mostly saying no. But when push came to shove, Catherine was willing to. Drawing and quartering is torture. She was willing to torture someone who challenged her rule. Um, I think that enlightened despotism is interesting. You see this movement of these rulers kind of loosening their reins on their grip, but I also think that you see them using kind of these enlightened ideas as a way to increase their power, and that you also see some pushback against them when they don't make the reforms that are being demanded of them. So it's really kind of like laying the stage for the eventual French Revolution and then all of the other 19th century revolutions. Um, so that was the last kind of, let's see, are there any other questions on here? Light and Despot, 7 Years' War, we did those. And then we have, I defined Junkers. And then, and then there was also a question about the difference between the first and second industrial revolution. Um, the first industrial revolution is going to be, if you remember from when we did the urban game, the first industrial revolution really gets underway. I mean, first off, you have to have an agricultural revolution first, right? Because you have to have enough food production in order to free labor so that there are workers to actually go work in cities. So the agricultural revolution is like a sort of 17th century thing. Simple things like crop rotation, introduction of potatoes, more like realizing how to breed animals to kind of maximize whatever they were looking for, whether that was like cows for meat or milk. Um, And then there was also some land reclamation. The Dutch in particular were really good at like reclaiming land, sort of swampy areas, and using that for farming. Thus, the phrase, I think I said this in class, that there's a quote in Holland that says, "The God made the Dutch, but the Dutch made Holland," because literally a fair amount of it is under sea level. Okay, so all of that happens in the 17th century. And then, as we saw in the urban game, you have this cottage industry that develops as bourgeoisie manufacturers are sending materials out into especially women's homes, um, to be spun into thread, to be loomed into cloth. And then when the water frame is invented in, I think it was 1743, but somebody would have to check me on that date. Um, the production of factories is just going to explode, right? Because they're able to be so much more efficient, like exponentially more efficient than anyone could do in their home. And it made a lot more sense once you had like this big factory to have women come to the factory rather than have the stuff be sent back to their homes. So that's kind of the beginning of the first revolution. And then you get this revolution in like heavy industry that's going to come more like, so that 1743, that's like mid 18th century. In the early to mid 19th century, like 1830s ish, you get a shift to more heavy industry. So focusing more on steel and railroads and steam power. So that first revolution in industry is just like, hey, factories work. I mean, things like the um, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which allowed them to just like manufacture cotton more efficiently. It got all of the seeds out of it. Like that could be part of the first industrial revolution. But in the second, it's much more like big, heavy industry with steel, railroads, and just real big push and demand for raw materials. A lot more. They're using some coal in the first industrial revolution to power the water frames. The demand for that is really going to increase, and then eventually that pressure of industrialization is going to push European powers to change their method of imperialism. So rather than just like having some colonies and like they were trading partners, the scramble for Africa is going to start in the 1880s. At the Berlin Conference, they kind of create rules for carving up Africa. And that second phase of imperialism is really about extracting resources from the colonies, and like all of the railroads, for instance, are like from say mines to the coast where they're taking things out of the country, and none of it's about like improving the colonies or investing in infrastructure or anything like that. It's just kind of raw exploitation. So that was my last question there. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Do you guys have any other questions that you want to add in the chat? You feel good to go? We haven't talked about the French Revolution at all, and that is definitely a big thing. There are there's some videos on my channel that I think review that pretty well. I think the videos on World War One are really solid and really cover what we've talked about in class. They reviewed I've made those videos during COVID. I just had more time to sit and review, or sit and put them together. But that year they changed the duration of the exam and what it was going to cover. So there's really nothing post World War One because the exam that year didn't test on it. So any other questions? Is anybody here? I'm going to just check my phone and see if any of you sent me a message back on Remind to tell me that there was some technical issue that I don't know about. Nope. All right. Let's see if there's any other questions in this email that I missed. If you guys don't have other questions, I may just cut it off. And I don't care if you're my student or not. If you're somebody watching from another school, you're welcome to pop on here with your questions too. Um, Renaissance. So somebody asked, before we move on to a big topic, could you go over Renaissance primary sources? Sure. If you guys still have, I made you a Renaissance cheat sheet. I'm going to open that just to reference. But the things that I remember that we read were the Machiavelli's The Prince, 1513. Education of a Christian Prince by Erasmus, which I think was 1515. I'd have to double check the date of that. I just remember it was very close to when Machiavelli's The Prince was written. So those two, I think, in contrast, are really interesting. We also looked at The Courtier. I'm trying to remember exactly which. Let me open my notes here so I don't miss anything. Erasmus. That Renaissance cheat sheet, by the way, the top of it says 3 major themes of the Renaissance. It has humanism, individualism, secularism. It's also classicism, sort of defined there as a subtopic of humanism. Okay, big humanists that you want to know are Petrarch. He was kind of known as the father of humanism. He wrote sonnets, like poetry. He was the first to use the term the Dark Ages to describe like this period that they were coming out of. We also read, that's right, I forgot we read an excerpt from the Decameron, which is basically a bunch of people in Florence escaping into the countryside and sort of telling stories, trying to escape the plague. It's one of the first books that was just intended for entertainment, and it's it was kind of a big deal because it was like realistic, ordinary characters. We also read Castiglione, The Courtier. I don't know. Would it be helpful to put these names in the chat? Because I know that it's not always easy to spell all this stuff, but let's see. Okay, so for Petrarch, it was a big deal just because he's the father of humanism. For Boccaccio, it was that this was like really groundbreaking, realistic characters. For Castiglione, the courtier is just taking. It's basically about men and women in this court, like surrounding the duke or the prince or whatever. I think it was the Duke of Urbino, and it became just like a manual of proper behavior. So you really see the Renaissance getting all the way into very ordinary life. And then Pico wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man, which was kind of like a manifesto for the Renaissance in that it was just emphasizing the importance of regular people, which is a big humanist idea. I don't know if you want me to also go over art. We looked at Masaccio, who painted Escape from the Garden of Eden, Donatello's freestanding David bronze statue, Brunelleschi's dome, which was such a big deal because it was the first dome since since ancient times. Da Vinci's, we looked at a lot. The Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, his self-portrait, The Vitruvian Man. Raphael, there's in the Papal Apartments, the School of Athens. There's various paintings of Madonnas. He had like the Culpeper Madonna and the Madonna with pomegranate. And you see all of these chiaroscuro and sfumato techniques in Raphael that we were looking at. Sfumato was like the softening, like how your eyes actually work, and chiaroscuro was like the shadows and sort of realistic use of light, the contrast between light and dark. And then Michelangelo, we looked at the Marble David, the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment, which was that wall in the Sistine Chapel, and then I think those are the. We might have looked at some other marble statues that he'd done. He also did the dome of St. Peter's. Um, we didn't talk about um, Titan much, but he did these very. He was Spanish, I believe. He painted these very kind of vivid, dramatic paintings. I think as long as you know a couple of those, you're fine. You don't need to know all of them. Any other specific questions? I'm a little, let me think. I'm a little worried about our coverage of the Industrial Revolution because I think it's kind of like, everything changes, life changes. But I think it's also important to remember some of the specific things, like that the Industrial Revolution happens in Britain because they have this like, um, every part of Britain is 90 miles from the coast. So that gives them an advantage. They have a lot of navigable rivers. They have a lot of natural resources like coal and iron ore. The agricultural revolution had already given them kind of a mobile labor force. Um, you don't have as much influence by like middle class capitalists in other countries as you did in England. I suppose the Dutch would be the exception to that, but there are, they just were able to really pass laws that were beneficial for them because of Parliament. And there's just a large and growing middle class with like the goal of increasing their profit. Um, the big innovations that you see early on with the Industrial Revolution were mostly, they were all related to textiles, but the water frame in 1771, I had that date wrong, um, Richard Arkwright, the spinning jenny, which is James Hargreaves. I think those are the two that we talked about the most. And then steam power comes later. James Watts's steam engine will be closer to like the 17, I think closer to 1790. Um, that's going to be a big shift. The increase in, they build a lot of canals, so that's going to allow for more efficient transport of goods, but then eventually the steam engine will replace that. Um, Especially by like 1800, you really see railroads taking over canals, probably a little after 1800. So the factory industry is going to change everything. And, these cities that were so small, like, Liverpool and Manchester were like decent sized cities, but not huge. And their population is just going to absolutely explode, which is then going to lead to the issue of like rotten boroughs that we get to later in like the mid 19th century, with people demanding parliamentary reform because you had these boroughs that didn't really have that many people living in them, but still had representation in parliament, whereas you had cities like um, Manchester that just didn't have very much, or Birmingham didn't have much parliamentary representation, or at least not sufficient to recognize the population explosion. The Crystal Palace in 1851 is another like big kind of moment in Britain's industrial dominance. It was meant to be this. The World Fair was in London in 1851, the first World Fair, and it's just this demonstration of everything great that London has, really focusing on like progress and industrialization and new technology. Um, and the Crystal Palace was a building, and then the Crystal Palace was later moved to a neighborhood in London that's now called Crystal Palace that's apparently a little bit run down. So that industrialization is eventually going to spread to the continent. So you get pretty gradual change with France. In 1815, there is no Germany, right? It's not unified until 1871. But you do see once, especially after Prussia is really kind of on the rise, you're going to see the creation of the Zollverein, which is led by Prussia, and that kind of free trade zone that's going to lead to an explosion of industrialization in Germany. But it's really after unification that German industrialization just absolutely takes off, and they're going to have pretty strong like steel production, railroad construction is just going to explode. Germany now has one of the most efficient rail systems in the world, if not the most efficient. Um, and they're going to be able to really challenge England by the time of World War One. And other parts of the world are a little slower, like Belgium and kind of some parts of northern Italy had really developed their industrialization by the mid 19th century. The United States certainly had. But then you really see these countries like Austria and Russia that are going to remain very agricultural, really based on sort of serf labor. Russia doesn't free the serfs until 1861 or 1881? I'd have to double check the date. I think it was 1861, and I think Alexander II was assassinated in 1881. Spain doesn't really have the natural resources um, and the geographic advantages that other countries had. They've got a pretty big open plain in the middle of the nation with like fewer navigable rivers, so transportation was harder. And then also, in Spain and Russia, you have these really strong aristocratic kind of privileges really sunk in, and Russia will continue practicing serfdom for quite a while. So that's going to be hard to get industrialization going. There are some big reforms in England, like the Factory Act of 1833, basically said that there would be limitations on hours, that there would be regular inspections of factory safety, that there was a guy named Edwin Chadwick who published an excerpt. I'm pretty sure we read pieces of this about the sanitary conditions of the laboring population. And he just talked about, basically just how disgusting the tenements were and how gross they were and how unhealthy they were. So that's going to lead to the Public Health Act of 1848, which is a great one to remember because 1848 is such a turning point year that you really already know 1848. So now you just have to remember that they had new sewage systems, and you'll really see that spread like under Napoleon III, previously known as Louis Napoleon. Um, France will also, I think in the 1860s, puts their sewer in place in Paris. The Chartists in London in the 1830s are going to be pushing for universal male suffrage, and the idea that you would pay members of parliament for their service, because parliament, if you wanted to serve in parliament, you had to have enough money to just like do that, right? Which meant that you basically had to be pretty wealthy. And they were pushing to have that be a paid position so that regular people could do it as well. There was some backlash to industrialization. The Luddites were basically just rejecting mechanization and would sometimes like attack machines and stuff like that. Any other big questions? Definitely look at the isms: liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, romanticism. I think being well versed in those, I mean, you really need to know all of those, I think, in order to answer anything in the 19th century, even in the 20th century. And just the idea, too, that like conservatism changes, right? In 1815, it's about like the Congress of Vienna, it's like rolling back and putting monarchies back in place. And by, the 1870s, unification happens under the tutelage of like Bismarck and Cavour, who are fairly conservative, even if they're realpolitik practicers, more, interested in results, I guess, than the ideology behind it. They're still, allowing for constitutional restrictions on the king, for instance, when they unify. There was a lot of literature and history in the 19th century that we didn't touch on. We talked about it a little bit with the Romantics, but I would review those. If any of you want to borrow either of my review books, please let me know. I'm happy to lend them to you as long as I get them back. Revolutions in 1830 and 48. Any other questions? Chase, you might be the only one here, so if you have any questions, let me know. I'm just flipping through here trying to see if there's any. I feel like unification was fairly recent, so maybe we don't need to worry about that too much. Oh, the one thing, just thinking back real quick, I saw this thing here on the Second Industrial Revolution. The thing that I forgot to mention about the Second Industrial Revolution, so like 1875 to about 1900, is mass production. The assembly line is a big change there. The Bessemer process is going to make steel kind of replace iron as like the big metal that everyone needs. A lot of revolution in transportation and communication with the advent of steamships and railroads. I'm glad you can see, because I can't actually see who's here. So yeah, I'm happy to review the French Revolution. I could talk about the French Revolution until tomorrow morning if you want. I'm not going to, because I'm going to go to sleep. But let me flip back in my book to make sure I don't miss any important terms. So really starts with like the American Revolution, 1776, 7 Years War, with France being kind of bankrupt. And if we want to go even further back to that, it starts with, I don't know if you can see it, but Louis the 14th here in the Palace of Versailles. I have a snow globe. The idea that, France, Louis had brought a lot of power, had really centralized the state, had really emphasized the importance of the king. But I think he also had made it so that the state was so central that there was really no mechanism to listen to the people. And so Versailles was extremely expensive to build. It was extremely expensive to maintain. So the first thing that you would want to talk about would be, I think, a long-term cause would be the massive debt of the Ancien regime. So Ancien regime just means pre-revolutionary France. It's such an important, revolution, because not only does it like rewrite the map of Europe, but it also changes. Sorry, my dog's coming to say hello. Hi, Luna. It also is really going to change like ideological shifts in, sort of invent the idea of political parties, I suppose. Okay, so looking at France in the Ancien regime, there's 3 estates. The first estate is the clergy. The second estate is the nobility. Those 2 together made up 2 to 3% of the population. The third estate is literally everyone else. You could be a really wealthy member of the third estate. I think that's key to remember. Sometimes people will define the third estate as peasants. No. The peasants aren't really that involved early on in the revolution. It's the bourgeoisie. It's those like slightly wealthier members of the third estate who are really pushing for reforms to match their newfound wealth. So just like the American Revolution to a degree, I would say the French Revolution is about taxation without representation. There was a tax called the taille, which is spelled, I'll put it in the chat here. Oops. I'm off on my. The taille was a tax that the nobility and the clergy were exempt from paying. The third estate was bearing all of that. So basically all of this debt that they had not caused, they were being asked to pay for. And so when Louis calls the Estates General to bring those three estates together. Um, the third estate arrives kind of pissed off. There's a really important document at the beginning of the French Revolution that I think is like a short-term Enlightenment cause. So if you look at the Enlightenment, that's a real long-term cause, right? Like the idea that people have natural rights. John Locke was like 100 years before with the English Civil War. But Abbé Sieyès, what is the third estate? Um, I'll put it in the chat. Is published in January of 1789. So as everyone is voting on their delegates to the Estates General, this comes out in France. They meet in May and they show up ready for change, like ready to reform the government. And the first and second estate are like, what do you mean? Like, we're doing fine. Why would we reform anything? So one of the things Abbé Sieyès' document said, what is the third estate? Nothing. What do they demand to become? Something, because they do all of the labor. And what is it? What has it been till now? And then what do they demand is basically to become something. So those three estates meet, and they wanted to vote as they traditionally had, that they wanted to vote by estate, not by head. Now, if they had voted by estate, the first and second estate, one vote for each estate is always going to outvote the third estate. If they had voted by head, there were, I think, 648 members of the third estate, like 300 for the other two estates. So they would have had a very slight majority. As they're debating this, the king orders them locked out of the Estates General. They retire to the tennis court in Versailles, and there they write the tennis court oath. And in the tennis court oath, they basically swear to stay together until they've written a constitution and they declare themselves a national assembly. So they now start acting as the Parliament of Paris, the Parliament of France. The king then, there were rumors that the king was going to disband the National Assembly, that moves to Paris and starts putting out, making plans. And so the National Assembly will help lead a charge on the Bastille prison on July 14th, 1789. That's really seen as like the beginning of the revolution. Like everything up till now is like, okay, maybe there'll be some reform. But at the Bastille, they cut off the governor of the Bastille's head and put it on a pike and parade it around, right? So once heads are getting cut off, the revolution has begun. And I think that's an important distinction to remember, like what's a cause, what's happening during the revolution, what's an effect. Once people's heads are on spikes, I would say the revolution's underway. Everything after that is kind of part of the revolution. There might be some things that you could talk about, like the Great Fear in the countryside in August of 1789, where the peasants are rising up against the manor owners. That's early on. I think you could argue that like those ideas sort of were already there, and the revolution just allows them to happen. So you could still look at that as a cause, but you can't look at like the hyperinflation of the assignat, the paper money that's printed from 1790 to 1795. It loses like 100% of its value, 99% of its value. You can't call that a cause because that's like something that's happening during the revolution. It's an effect of the outbreak of the revolution. You could also look at, so those are sort of social causes, the third estate. Intellectual causes would all be about the Enlightenment, all of those people I already talked about. I think the key idea there is that the philosophes had brought the ideas of the English Enlightenment to France, right? So they had made them accessible and written in French so that the average Frenchman could read them. And they were certainly well known by the time the Estates General met. And then the economic causes. We talked about the debt. There had already been quite a lot of attempts to reform the spending in the government. Jacques Necker, for instance, was what was his actual? I think he was like a deputy of finance. I forget his actual title, but he basically put out an account of the state budget and revealed some of the enormous waste. He's eventually fired, but then he is that document where he said like, hey, here's the budget, here's all of my plans. He's dismissed, but then later the king will bring that back during the revolution. Is like, hey, look, I am trying to make reform. So all of this thus begins like the liberal phase of the revolution. So from 1789 to 1791, you have what looks to be turning into a constitutional monarchy. So the National Assembly, um, and the tennis court oath, basically declares themselves declares themselves to exist. The Bastille, now they've got some guns, which is the reason that they went there in the first place. Um, the Marquis de Lafayette kind of ends up acting as like a mediator between both sides. July to August, you have the Great Fear, the peasants attacking the manors in the countryside. The August decrees from August 4th to 9th will end feudalism, um, declare everyone equal under the law, like really big sweeping reforms. Late August, they published the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which very similar to like the American Declaration of Independence or like the Bill of Rights is laying out sort of natural basic rights of every French citizen, really based on the ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité, or liberty, equality, fraternity. Um, in October of 1789, uh, the March of the Women begins at a marketplace in front of the Hotel de Cité. I don't know how to say it in French. I'm always just speaking French. But they basically, there's food shortages. And this was an ongoing issue. The price of bread for the average Parisian had gone up exponentially, and they just couldn't afford it anymore with new taxes. There was also shortages. So like a lot of um, grain was being replaced by things like sawdust in the bread. And so the market that meets in October, I think on October 5th, they're just frustrated and angry, and they literally like rip cannons off the hotel, which is literally just like the French word for like a palace. I believe it's now the Parisian City Hall. I'm not sure if it was at the time. But anyway, that's where they're meeting, and they then march all the way to Versailles, which is a long march. I mean, it's like a 50-ish minute train ride now, so it would have taken them all day to get there. Surely people rode ahead and told the king they were coming. They get to Versailles and they demand that the king basically give them bread. They say they know that the Queen Marie Antoinette is hoarding food. She just needs to help them. Someone tell the king. Surely he doesn't know how corrupt his wife is. Um, she really gets demonized during the revolution, I think in part because she's Austrian, in part because she liked fancy clothes and dresses, in part because she's a woman. Like some of the propaganda about her is just vile. Um, but she is sort of called to the front by the crowd. Um, a couple of the king and queen's attendants are killed. Their heads are put on pikes, and basically the crowd will force the king and queen to move back to Paris, so away from Versailles, where Louis XIV had established the court, more than 100 years before, back to Paris. So literally, like a bunch of armed women are going to take this monarchy from like, hey, we need to raise taxes in March or May of 1789, and by October they're like back to Paris with you. So I think you really see a shift in power there, and then that March of the Women is going to lead to what's known as the October Days, which is just like a lot of I mean, the king and queen are basically going to be prisoners in Paris for the rest of the revolution. There's a lot of violence in the city of Paris. Um, at that point, it looks like the kind of November to 1790, the National Assembly confiscates the land that's owned by the Catholic Church, which is really going to divide the revolution because France is really Catholic, right? Like a majority of people in France were Catholic, and so there's a lot of dispute on that. They're going to issue paper currency, the assignats, based on the value of the land. It's going to end up having really rapid inflation. The civil constitution of the clergy will require all priests to swear an oath of loyalty to the revolution, to the idea that the revolution is proper and right. And about half of them swear the oath, but the other half then are like, kind of became like a rallying point for the counter revolution. Eventually, they finish a constitution, the Constitution of 1791, which basically granted some basic rights to the French people. They had it created a division between active and passive citizens. So, active citizens basically owned property, and passive citizens and women weren't allowed to participate fully in the state. It still really shows like how much the revolution is in the hands of like the wealthy bourgeoisie. But the king and the emigres, the nobles who had fled the country already, um, are sort of under the encouragement of the emigres. He and his family are going to try to flee the country. So the flight to Varennes, um, basically they're stopped near the border, and he's forced back to the Tuileries Palace. He had actually written a pretty nasty note about the revolution, or sorry, about the Constitution as he left. And so in July of that month, they're going to demand that the king is overthrown. And then on September, there's a Champ de Mars massacre. I don't think we talked about this in class, but is basically um, the National Guard is going to disperse some of the crowd there, and that's led by Lafayette. And I think like 50 people are killed. So it's really going to turn public opinion um, against the monarchy. And so now all of these symbols of the revolution become like really key to French culture. The Liberty Cap, calling everyone like citoyen, which is like citizen, using the informal address in French instead of the formal. Um, they even consider having like a national costume at one point and asked David, the painter who had done the tennis court oath, to design one. That was never put into effect. The Jacobin clubs are going to get more and more influence, and then eventually those Jacobin clubs are going to be where like Robespierre and Danton and Marat come from. There is some pushback against the revolution at this point. The English writer Edmund Burke will write Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he talks about how basically they should have slowed down, they should have paid attention to tradition. Um, that's published in, I think, 1791. Thomas Paine, who's in Paris during some of the revolution, will respond with the rights of man, sort of defending the revolution. Um, and then eventually the radical phase begins in 1792. So inflation is still really bad. The royal family was clearly like not totally on board with the revolution. You have a lot of counter-revolutionary powers, and then the war was going on, and so that's going to really radicalize people. In August of 1791, the Austrian emperor, who would have been Marie Antoinette's brother, along with the Prussian king, will put out the Declaration of Pillnitz, basically saying, hey, if other nations help us, we'll restore order to France. And then that, along with the action of the king and the emigres, the nobles who had fled the country, convince everyone that the only way to save the revolution is to spread it across Europe. And so um, the French army is going to basically declare war on Austria. The Brunswick Manifesto in July of 1792 says to the revolutionaries, if the king and queen are harmed, Prussia and Austria will invade Paris and like burn it to the ground. So then they later execute them, right? So that's just justification for the war to continue. And then in September of 1792, the Austro-Prussians are like, the Austrians and the Prussians together are sort of on the border of France. And so the revolutionaries massacre all sorts of people in prisons. And then on September 22nd, 1792, they declare France a republic. So 9/22/92 becomes day one, year one of the new French Republic. Robespierre at that point becomes he was the head of the Committee of Public Safety, which was a part of the National Convention, which was basically the parliament created by the Constitution of 1791. They then write a new constitution, because if you have a new government, you have to have a new constitution. The It's never put into place, though, because by the time it's passed, the country's in crisis and they've declared a state of emergency. The Reign of Terror begins under the Committee of Public Safety, which basically was like the part of the National Convention that was meant to protect the revolution. So they start really attacking anyone they see being connected to counter-revolutionary movements. So a lot of Catholics who are against the civil constitution of the clergy, a lot of people who are against the draft, the emigres, royalists. They have these revolutionary tribunals, which are basically like show trials, and force people to um, uh, be put on trial, and they were like tried and executed usually within a day, or like tried one day and executed the next day. The culture here really gets kind of crazy. Like you have because religion is old and not modern. They create new festivals like the Cult of the Supreme Being, the Festival of the Supreme Being, which was sort of Notre Dame is renamed a Temple of Reason. And so Robespierre tries to create this like civil religion. And the Festival of the Supreme Being is created in 1794. They standardize weights and measures, which, that's good. They get the metric system. They abolish slavery. They create the new calendar, thus my decimal clock in my classroom. Honestly, the military is doing pretty well at this point, the French military, because of the levée en masse, the draft. They had a draft. They were the largest country in France at that time. And they also happen to have some genius generals like Napoleon. So there's just some things coming together which are giving them the advantage. Danton was the leader of the Paris Commune, and he is really starting to criticize Robespierre and just saying like, hey, maybe we don't need to execute all of the Girondins, all of our political enemies, the more moderate Jacobins. Maybe we could just push him out of office or something. And so he's executed along with many of his kind of supporters. Eventually, Robespierre stands in front of the National Convention, points at all of them, and is like, we need one more purge of this revolution because there's still, threats here. And so they like attack him, stab him, and put him on trial and execute him the next day. So they're all killed by guillotine, by the way, which was meant to be a nice, equal form, enlightened form of execution, because everyone got like the same clean death. And then after Robespierre's execution, that period is known as the Thermadorian reaction. So Thermidor was the name of the month that he was killed on the new revolutionary calendar. Again, they have to write a new constitution. So the Constitution of 1795, aka Constitution of Year 3, is written. It basically said that all males could vote, but it was very kind of filtered down. So they had electors who would then choose the representatives for this two-chamber assembly. So rather than having a one-chamber parliament with the National Convention, they had a two-chamber one like the U.S. has. Basically, the Council of 500 is similar to the American House of Representatives. The Council of Elders was similar to the American Senate, including in numbers. Like the Council of Elders was much smaller than the Council of 500, and they try to slow the revolution down a little bit. It's more conservative. Unfortunately, there was still the directory just was not very popular. They also created a three-man oligarchy to be like the executive branch in order to keep someone like Robespierre from sort of taking total control. So they have this idea of like branches of government. But the directory is never that popular. Inflation's still a problem. Some aristocrats return and are just living these like frivolous sort of you know, really obsessed with fashion and things like that. And French people are still like, hey, I'd like to eat. So there's still problems. They're not that popular, which is going to leave the door open for Napoleon, who on the coup d'etat of 18th Brumaire, aka November 9th, 1799, will take over the government. He had been very successful in his Italian campaigns during the Revolution. He had created new Italian republics. He had really like outmaneuvered the Habsburg army, and really had kind of taken control on his own. Like he negotiated with the Austrian emperor on his own. He's doing really well, and so he was really popular. And he's eventually then chosen after the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire as first consul. So they create a consulate. They had again three consuls, but Napoleon really was like the main guy. Interestingly, one of the other ones was Abbé Sieyès, the guy who wrote What is the Third Estate. So he is going to pass things like the Napoleonic Code, which will create a legal code across not just France, but all of the territories they conquer, which is really important because that's going to help spread revolutionary ideas across the continent. Um, the Napoleonic Code really, I would say, still embodied a lot of ideas of the revolution, though it did roll back some reforms. So, for instance, under the revolution, there were 10, 7 reasons that people could get divorced. Under the Napoleonic Code, there were only 3, and it largely was like a decrease in rights for women. He's going to create a professional bureaucracy, like really focusing on schools in order to educate them. A lot of like legal and social policies. He creates a Bank of France, the Lycée, which is with there's an accent on that first E, which is basically free public education. Um, so those are all pretty big deals. He signs a concordat with the Pope in 1801, which basically just says, "I'll tell you what, you agree to let us keep all the land we took during the Revolution, and I won't bother you, and we'll recognize Catholicism as the majority religion in France." So he does quite a lot, but then of course, it all falls apart with the continental system, and then the invasion of Russia. And if you don't have any more questions, I think that's probably a good place to end. Napoleon's eventually defeated at Waterloo by the 6th and then later the 7th Coalition during the Congress of Vienna. He makes his comeback, the 100 Days. And I think we should, if this is helpful for you, I'm happy to do it again next Monday, but I will also pester your classmates to get some more questions in here. So um, start thinking of any questions or things that you want to review for next week if you want to do this again. And you can always ask me in class as well. And I will see you tomorrow. So have a good night.